Okay, so for my presentation, I wanted to do how much responsibility did Athens bear for the widespread warfare of the classical period? Okay, all right, so here is a picture of um, Athens and Sparta fighting one another. So, overview of what Athens was to begin with. Athens was a polis, which was one of the city states that popped up all over the Greek world. Um, these were basically like economical powers where farmers, aristocrats, all of them came together to have like a countryside where they made all their money, crops, all that stuff, and then in the city state where everybody lived. So two major polises that rose up around this time period were um, Athens and Sparta. Um, Athens, in particular, they followed under a law which was established by Draco, who was an Athenian aristocrat. This code was like okay at first, but as things went on, the richer people in the area became richer, and the poor people became poor, which in turn created an economic dependence for the smaller people, which honestly ended up in a lot of slavery and people becoming heavily in debt to the rich. Um, as you can imagine, this caused like a pretty major internal turmoil, and I think this is the original cause of some of the fighting. And then right here is a picture of one of the artifacts of the Athenian polis. Okay, so the beginning of the warfare and why it began. So, like I said, I believe that a lot of the warfare began because a lot of the internal turmoil with the richer becoming richer, the poor becoming poorer, and a lot of those poor people wanted to move out of those tightly packed polises and start over in another one. But as you can imagine, people who already live in other policies don't want a ton of other people coming, stealing their jobs, and taking their wealth. Um, so the first actual major conflict that came up was when the Ionians tried to rebel against Persia, and Athens was actually the first one to jump in and try to help them. But as I read, I learned that Athens was kind of half-heartedly about this jump in to help rebel against Persia. They might have helped out a little bit, but they really didn't want. They wanted to show that they were big enough to be involved, but maybe not big enough to actually win this. This later led to the rebellion by the Persians. So the Persians rebelled um, against the Athenians, and the Athenians, with a smaller military, actually lost against the Persians. Later on down the road, the Athenians fought back in a naval battle, and they actually ended up winning with sufficient knowledge with their navy vessels. And here's a picture of some of the fighting going on in that time. So as soon as that war ended, the Athenians actually started to take advantage. They knew that after defeating the Persians, they got pretty power hungry and believed that they could beat anybody. And this is where the creation of the Delian League came, which was pretty much a military alliance to protect themselves against any other attackers. So the Athenians started to pretty much take everything that they wanted, by force. This, whether it was from their allies, whether it was from people they didn't like, and this in particular really started to worry their allies, which one of them was Sparta at this time, and they became increasingly worried about Athens because they thought that they were going to take over and make them non-existent. So they started to rebel, and this is really when Greece split up into like two major powers, which was Sparta and Athens. So this kind of started the war, the Peloponnesian War, which was between Athens and Sparta. This kind of went back and forth. There was a little bit of peace for a fair amount of the time, but for the most part, it was pretty heavy turmoil where the two were going back and forth. Yeah. So here's a picture of kind of like a stalemate between the two, just fighting back and forth. So an overview of pretty much everything that I've talked about. The polises, which are the city-states. Two big ones were Athens and Sparta. Like I said, a lot of I believe internal turmoil was pretty much the main causality to all the problems. Um, and then the Ionians tried to rebel against the Persians, and this is when Athens stepped in, and obviously it was a fail, and that was the cause of the Persian War. Um, and then after this, when the Athenians won against Persia towards the end of the war, they created the Delian League, and this is when the Athenians actually really become power hungry, and this sparks the Peloponnesian War, which obviously ended in turmoil. And then so this brings me to like my overall opinions. In my opinion, I believe that Athens really should have focused on their internal problems more than expanding outwards and getting into fights that they didn't need to be in. One of these fights, for example, was the Ionian Rebellion. There was no reason for them to step in that. Like I said, this started the Persian War, and that was a huge downfall economically. And it tore the region apart. Secondly, I believe that when the Athenians became really power hungry, they scared a lot of their allies. One of these being Sparta, and in conclusion, this started the Peloponnesian War, like I said. And honestly, I believe that there was no reason for a lot of this conflict to begin. Like I said, Athens should have focused on themselves instead of trying to be bigger than everybody else. So this leads to my discussion question. Based on my presentation, are you convinced that the Athenians were the head of the turmoil that split the Greek world up, or do you think other polises such as the Spartans had much more to do with it? Thanks for watching. Let me know.